The 68th floor of the Sterling Tower gleamed like a jewel suspended above Manhattan's chaos. Through floor-to-ceiling windows, the city sparkled in the December twilight, each light representing dreams, struggles, and ambitions of 8 million souls below. But tonight, in Robert Sterling's penthouse, only 30 souls mattered. The carefully curated guest list of New York's financial elite gathered for what the engraved invitations called an evening of charitable distinction. Maya Washington moved like a ghost between the clusters of designer gowns and tailored tuxedos, her black uniform rendering her nearly invisible to the guests whose champagne glasses she refilled with practiced precision. At 26, she had perfected the art of being present without being seen, a survival skill learned through 2 years of serving Manhattan's upper class while carrying the weight of deferred dreams and mounting student debt from her incomplete Juilliard education. The penthouse itself was a monument to wealth and taste, or perhaps to wealth masquerading as taste. Persian rugs worth more than most people's annual salaries covered Italian marble floors, while oil paintings by masters whose names Maya recognized from her art history classes adorned walls that had never known the touch of anything but perfection. In the corner, almost carelessly placed, stood an antique cello, its amber wood gleaming under crystal chandeliers that cast rainbow fragments across the room like scattered promises. Maya had noticed the cello the moment she'd arrived for work that morning. It called to her with a familiarity that made her chest tight with longing. She recognized the maker's mark, a Gragnani from the early 1800s, the kind of instrument that could make even a mediocre player sound divine, and a divine player sound like they were channeling the voice of God himself. Her fingers had itched to touch it, to feel the smooth wood beneath her calloused fingertips, to draw her bow across its strings and lose herself in the music that had once defined her entire world. But Maya Washington was no longer a musician. She was staff. And staff didn't touch priceless instruments that cost more than most people made in a decade. "Excuse me, miss." A woman's voice, sharp with the particular authority that comes from never being denied anything, cut through Maya's reverie. Victoria Sterling Ashford stood before her, blonde hair pulled back in a chignon so perfect it looked carved from marble, her ice-blue eyes scanning Maya with the calculating precision of someone who viewed the world as a series of problems to be solved or obstacles to be removed. "Yes, ma'am." Maya kept her voice neutral, professional, though something in Victoria's gaze made her skin crawl. My father would like to speak with you." Victoria's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Something about your musical background." Maya's blood ran cold. How could Robert Sterling know anything about her past? She'd been careful to keep her employment application vague, listing only basic qualifications and work history. The last thing she wanted was for her employers to know that their domestic help had once been a scholarship student at one of the world's most prestigious music conservatories, that she'd once dreamed of performing on stages like Carnegie Hall instead of serving canapes to people who treated culture like another commodity to be acquired and displayed. Across the room, Robert Sterling held court near the bar, his silver hair catching the light as he gestured expansively while telling what was undoubtedly another story about his financial conquests. At 64, he possessed the kind of commanding presence that came from decades of making decisions that affected thousands of lives without losing a moment's sleep over the consequences. His laugh was rich and practiced, the laugh of a man who had never met a room he couldn't own within minutes of entering it. As Maya approached, she caught fragments of his conversation, something about acquiring a distressed asset in Detroit, about the poetry of turning other people's desperation into profit. The men around him nodded with the fervor of disciples receiving wisdom from their prophet, their wives clutching champagne glasses like lifelines, while their eyes glazed over with the particular boredom of women who had married for security and discovered that security often came with the price of perpetual performance. "Ah, there she is!" Robert's voice boomed as he spotted Maya, and she felt every eye in the immediate vicinity turn toward her. The weight of their attention was suffocating, like being pinned beneath a microscope while specimens in lab coats debated her worth. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like you to meet Maya, one of our household staff." Maya has been with us for almost 2 years now, and she's been absolutely instrumental in keeping our home running smoothly. There was something in the way he said instrumental that made Maya's stomach clench. A few guests chuckled at what they seemed to interpret as wordplay, though Maya couldn't imagine what they found amusing about her employment with their host. But Maya here has hidden talents, Robert continued, his blue eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that made her want to step backward. Don't you, Maya? Something about music, wasn't it? You mentioned once that you used to play something. What was it again? Maya's throat felt like sandpaper. She had mentioned it once, months ago, when she'd been dusting the music room and Mrs. Sterling had asked about the wistful expression on her face as she'd cleaned around the piano. It had been a moment of weakness, a crack in the professional facade she'd worked so hard to maintain. She'd immediately regretted the admission, but Mrs. Sterling had seemed too medicated to remember or care about the personal details of the help's former life. Apparently, she'd been wrong. I used to play cello, sir. But that was a long time ago. Maya's voice came out smaller than she'd intended, and she hated herself for the weakness it revealed. A long time ago, Robert repeated, as if savoring the words. Well, time is relative, isn't it? Especially when it comes to muscle memory. The fingers never forget, do they? He gestured toward the antique cello in the corner, and Maya felt her heart stop. Mike, since we have such distinguished company tonight, and since it's for charity after all, why don't you treat us to a little performance? Consider it your contribution to the cause. The silence that followed was deafening. Maya could feel the weight of 30 pairs of eyes, could sense the mixture of anticipation and secondhand embarrassment radiating from the guests. Some seemed genuinely curious about what would happen next, while others appeared to be witnessing the beginning of what they expected would be a spectacular humiliation, the kind of train wreck that would provide gossip material for weeks to come. This was the moment Maya would remember for the rest of her life as the fork in the road where everything changed. She could refuse. She could claim illness, clumsiness, anything that would allow her to retreat to the kitchen and finish her shift in anonymous safety. She could protect herself from the exposure, from the vulnerability of revealing the dreams she'd tried so hard to bury. Or she could walk to that cello, sit down, and remind herself who she used to be. The antique instrument seemed to glow in the ambient light as Maya approached it, her legs moving as if controlled by some force outside her conscious will. Her hands trembled as she lifted the cello, feeling its weight settle against her body like an old friend she'd thought she'd never see again. The wood was warm to the touch, smooth and alive in a way that synthetic instruments could never match. As she positioned the bow, Maya closed her eyes and let herself remember. She remembered her first cello lesson at age 7 in the basement of St. Augustine's Community Center, where Sister Mary Catherine had introduced her to an instrument that was nearly as tall as she was. She remembered the first time she'd made it sing instead of screech, the way Dorothy's face had lit up with pride when Maya had played her first complete piece. She remembered audition day at Juilliard, the scholarship that had seemed like a golden ticket to a different life, the professors who had whispered that she had something special, something that couldn't be taught. And she remembered the phone call that had changed everything, the conversation that had sent her fleeing back to Chicago with her dreams in ruins, leaving her to rebuild herself as someone who served instead of someone who soared. But muscle memory, as Robert had noted, is a powerful thing. As Maya drew the bow across the strings for the first time in 3 years, the cello responded with a voice so pure and haunting that several guests actually gasped. The note hung in the air like a question, and Maya knew that whatever came next would determine not just the rest of her evening, but possibly the rest of her life. She began to play Bach's Suite No. 1 in G major, the piece that had first made her fall in love with the cello's possibilities. But this wasn't the technically perfect rendition she might have delivered in a conservatory practice room. This was raw, emotional, infused with 3 years of grief and longing and the particular pain that comes from burying your truest self so deep that you sometimes forget it ever existed. As the melody soared and dipped, Maya forgot about the watching eyes, forgot about her uniform and her position, and the careful boundaries she'd constructed around her new life. She was transported back to a time when music wasn't just something she did, but something she was. The notes poured out of her like confessions, like prayers, like the accumulated weight of every dream she'd convinced herself to abandon. When the last note faded into silence, Maya opened her eyes to find 30 faces staring back at her with expressions ranging from shock to admiration to something that might have been awe. But it was Robert Sterling's face that held her attention. The powerful businessman, the man who had orchestrated this moment as some kind of twisted entertainment, looked as if he'd seen a ghost. His champagne glass had slipped from his nerveless fingers to shatter on the marble floor, the sound sharp and final in the continuing silence. His face had gone ashen, his blue eyes wide with what Maya could only interpret as recognition, though she was certain they'd never met before she'd come to work in his house. "My God," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "My God, you... Where did you learn to play like that?" But before Maya could answer, before she could even begin to process what had just happened, the room erupted in applause. Guests pressed forward, voices overlapping in a chorus of praise and questions and demands for more. Business cards appeared as if by magic, hands reached out to touch her shoulders, and suddenly Maya found herself at the center of a storm of attention that felt both overwhelming and intoxicating. She had been invisible for 2 years. In the space of 5 minutes, she had become unforgettable. What Maya didn't know, as she accepted congratulations and tried to make sense of the chaos surrounding her, was that Robert Sterling's reaction had nothing to do with her performance and everything to do with a memory that had just been ripped open like an old wound. 27 years ago, he had held another young woman as she played that same piece on that same cello, had made her promises he'd never intended to keep, had walked away from a love that had inconveniently complicated his carefully planned ascent to power. The woman's name had been Eliza Washington, and as Robert Sterling stared at Maya's face, really looked at it for the first time since she'd entered his employment, he saw the ghost of the woman he'd once claimed to love, reflected in features that were unmistakably, impossibly familiar. The evening that had begun as a routine display of wealth and status had just become something far more dangerous, a reckoning with the past that Robert Sterling had paid handsomely to keep buried. And Maya Washington, the invisible young woman who had served his guests and cleaned his house for 2 years, had just become the most visible threat to everything he had built his life upon. As the applause finally died down and guests began to disperse into smaller conversations, Maya carefully returned the cello to its stand, her hands still trembling from the performance and the magnitude of what she sensed had just shifted in her world. She didn't know that across the room, Victoria Sterling Ashford was already pulling out her phone to begin investigating the mysterious background of the woman who had just captivated her father's guests with the same piece of music that had once made her father abandon his first love. The evening was far from over. But Maya's old life, the safe, invisible life she'd constructed from the ashes of her dreams, had just come to an end. And in its place, something far more complicated, far more dangerous, and infinitely more alive was about to begin. The kitchen beneath the Sterling penthouse buzzed with the particular energy that follows a successful event. Servers rushing to clear glasses, caterers packing leftover hors d'oeuvres, and the soft clatter of expensive china being carefully washed and stored. Maya moved through it all like a sleepwalker, her hands performing familiar tasks while her mind remained trapped in the echo of music that had poured from her soul just hours earlier. "Mia, you okay?" Carlos Mendoza's voice cut through her daze as he set down a tray of crystal stemware. At 29, he possessed the kind of weathered handsomeness that spoke of a life lived fully despite its challenges, calloused hands that could create culinary magic, dark eyes that held both warmth and wariness, and the careful posture of someone who had learned to make himself indispensable while remaining invisible. Maya looked up from the silver spoons she'd been polishing for the 3rd time, meeting his concerned gaze. Carlos was the only person in the Sterling household who had ever bothered to learn her real name, to ask about her life beyond these walls. In the 2 years they'd worked together, he'd become something between a friend and a lifeline, the person who reminded her that she was still human even when the job demanded she become furniture. "I don't know," she admitted, setting down the spoon with hands that still trembled slightly. "Carlos," What just happened up there? I mean, really happened. Carlos glanced toward the service elevator, ensuring they weren't overheard, then moved closer. What happened is that you reminded everyone in that room, including yourself, that you're more than just the help. That performance. He shook his head, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. I was listening from the kitchen, and I swear, even the dishwasher stopped working just to hear you play. Mr. Sterling looked like he'd seen a ghost, Maya whispered, the memory of Robert's ashen face sending a chill down her spine, and the way he stared at me, like he knew something I don't know about myself. Rich men like Sterling, they're used to controlling everything around them, Carlos said, his voice carrying the weight of experience with powerful men who treated people like possessions. Maybe you just showed him something he can't control, can't own. That scares people like him. What neither Maya nor Carlos could know was that 3 floors above, in Robert Sterling's private study, that very fear was manifesting in ways that would change all their lives forever. Robert stood before the wall of windows that offered a commanding view of Central Park, his reflection ghost-like in the dark glass. In his hand, he clutched a tumbler of 30-year-old scotch that had remained untouched for the past hour, his mind racing through memories he'd spent decades trying to forget. Eliza. The name echoed in his head like a prayer and a curse. 27 years ago, she had been everything he'd thought he wanted. Brilliant, passionate, beautiful, in a way that made his chest tight just thinking about her. They'd met at a gallery opening in Soho, where she'd been performing as part of an avant-garde music installation, her cello singing haunting melodies while paint dripped onto canvas in rhythm with her bow strokes. He'd been 37 then, already wealthy but not yet the titan he would become, married to Margaret but feeling increasingly trapped by the conventional life expected of men in his position. Eliza had represented freedom, authenticity, everything his carefully constructed world lacked. For 6 months, they'd conducted a secret affair that had felt like the most honest thing he'd ever done, until she'd told him she was pregnant. The memory of that conversation still had the power to make his hands shake. She'd been so hopeful, so radiant with the possibility of their future together. She'd talked about leaving New York, starting fresh somewhere they could be a real family. She'd even had names picked out, Eliza for a girl after her grandmother, or Marcus for a boy after his father. But Robert Sterling hadn't built his fortune by making romantic decisions. He'd seen only the scandal, the disruption to his carefully planned ascent to the top of New York's financial world. His political ambitions, his business relationships, his marriage to Margaret with its convenient connections to old Southern money, all of it would have crumbled under the weight of a mistress and an illegitimate child. So he'd made a choice that had haunted him ever since. He'd given Eliza money, enough to disappear, to start over, to raise the child somewhere far from New York. He'd convinced himself it was generous, practical, the best solution for everyone involved. He'd even arranged for ongoing support payments through a shell company, telling himself that financial responsibility equaled moral absolution. The last time he'd seen Eliza, she'd been standing in the lobby of his office building, her cello case in one hand and a small suitcase in the other, tears streaming down her face as she looked at him with an expression that mixed love and betrayal in equal measure. "You'll regret this," she'd whispered. Someday, you'll realize what you threw away, and it will destroy you." He'd watched her walk away and convinced himself he felt nothing but relief. Now, staring at his reflection in the dark window, Robert finally understood what she'd meant. Because Maya Washington, with her musical genius, her expressive eyes, and her uncanny resemblance to the woman he'd once claimed to love, might very well be the daughter he'd paid to never meet. "Sir?" James Torres's voice from the doorway interrupted Robert's spiraling thoughts. The head of security stood at attention, his expression carefully neutral in the way of men who had learned to navigate the moods of powerful employers. "What is it, Jimmy?" Robert didn't turn from the window, afraid that his face might betray the chaos raging inside him. "Mrs. Sterling asked me to check on you. You've been in here for over an hour, and you have the Yamamoto conference call in 20 minutes. Robert laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Tell Yamamoto we'll reschedule. Tell him I have a family emergency." The irony of those words wasn't lost on him. For the first time in decades, Robert Sterling might actually be telling the truth about putting family first. Sir, is everything all right? You seemed unsettled after the performance tonight." Robert finally turned, studying the face of the man who had been his most trusted employee for 8 years. Jimmy Torres had been a detective once, before budget cuts and political maneuvering had pushed him out of the NYPD. He was good at reading people, at sensing when stories didn't add up. If Robert was going to investigate Maya's background, and he knew he had no choice, he would need Jimmy's skills. "I need you to look into someone," Robert said, his voice carefully controlled, discreetly. Very discreetly. Jimmy straightened, slipping automatically into professional mode. Who's the target?" "Maya Washington, our employee. I want to know everything about her. Where she was born, who raised her, how she ended up in New York, everything." "May I ask why, sir? Has she done something to concern you?" Robert was quiet for a long moment, weighing how much to reveal. Let's just say that her performance tonight raised some questions about her background, questions that need answers." What Robert didn't say, what he couldn't bring himself to voice even to his most trusted confidant, was that those questions might very well tear apart everything he'd built his life upon. Because if Maya Washington was indeed his daughter, then his carefully constructed world was about to collapse under the weight of a 27-year-old secret. Meanwhile, 4 floors below in her cramped studio apartment in Washington Heights, Maya sat cross-legged on her narrow bed, staring at her reflection in the dark window of her fire escape. The contrast between her current surroundings and the opulent penthouse she'd left just hours earlier couldn't have been starker. Here, her entire life fit into 400 square feet, a kitchenette barely large enough for one person, a bathroom with a shower that only worked if you knew exactly how to jiggle the handle, and a single room that served as bedroom, living room, and practice space. In the corner, covered by a faded sheet, sat her own cello, a student model she'd bought used when she'd first arrived in New York, its tone decent, but nowhere near the singing quality of the antique Gragnani she'd played that evening. She'd been avoiding looking at it for weeks, but now she found herself drawn to it like a moth to flame. With trembling fingers, Maya pulled away the sheet and lifted the instrument, settling it against her shoulder in the familiar embrace she'd denied herself for too long. She began to play softly, mindful of her neighbors, working through scales and exercises that felt like stretching muscles after a long sleep. As she played, her mind wandered to the faces in Robert Sterling's penthouse, the mixture of surprise and admiration she'd seen reflected in 30 pairs of eyes. For 2 years, she'd convinced herself that part of her life was over, that the dreams she'd once carried were luxuries she could no longer afford. But tonight had reminded her of something she'd tried to forget. Music wasn't just what she did, it was who she was. Her phone buzzed with a text message, interrupting her reverie. Unknown number. "This is Elena Vasquez from the New York Times. I was at the Sterling event tonight and heard your performance. I'd like to speak with you about a potential feature story. Can we meet for coffee tomorrow? This could be life-changing." Maya stared at the message, her heart pounding. Elena Vasquez, she knew that name. The Times. Most respected music critic. The woman whose reviews could make or break careers, who had championed countless unknown artists and helped launch them to international acclaim. Life-changing? The words seemed to pulse on her screen, full of promise and terrifying possibility. A second text followed. "P.S. Bring your cello. I have a feeling this conversation is going to require a soundtrack." Maya set down her phone with shaking hands, her mind racing through 1,000 possibilities and fears. Was this real? Could one night, one spontaneous performance, really open doors she'd thought were closed forever? She picked up her cello again, this time playing a piece of her own composition, something she'd written during her darkest days after leaving Juilliard, a melody that captured the particular loneliness of dreams deferred. As the notes filled her small apartment, Maya made a decision that would set the second act of her story in motion. Tomorrow, she would meet Elena Vasquez. Tomorrow, she would take the first step back toward the life she'd abandoned. And tomorrow, whether she knew it or not, she would begin a journey that would force Robert Sterling to confront the choice he'd made 27 years ago and the daughter he'd paid to disappear. But tonight, in apartments separated by wealth, geography, and years of silence, Both Maya and Robert lay awake, haunted by the same haunting melody and the growing certainty that their lives were about to become inextricably intertwined in ways that neither could imagine and both might come to regret. The ripples from Maya's performance were spreading outward like circles in still water, and by morning, the quiet life she'd built for herself in the shadows of Manhattan's elite would begin its transformation into something far more visible, far more dangerous, and infinitely more alive with possibility. As the city hummed around them in the pre-dawn darkness, neither Maya nor Robert could know that by tomorrow evening, a photograph of her performance would be trending on social media with the caption, "Mystery musician brings Manhattan elite to tears with stunning surprise performance." The caption would go viral within hours, shared by music lovers, social justice advocates, and curious observers who would make Maya Washington's face recognizable to millions of people overnight. And in her Fifth Avenue apartment, Victoria Sterling Ashford would see that photograph and begin to understand that the quiet young woman who had served her family for 2 years was about to become something much more dangerous. A public figure with a story that might very well destroy everything the Sterling family had worked to build. The game was changing. The players were choosing sides, and Maya Washington, whether she realized it or not, had just become the most important piece on a chessboard she didn't even know existed. The morning sun cast long shadows across Bryant Park as Maya clutched her cello case and searched for Elena Vasquez among the early risers nursing their coffee at outdoor tables. She'd barely slept, her mind cycling through imagined conversations and potential disasters that could emerge from this meeting. Part of her had considered not coming at all. Staying invisible was safer, predictable, controllable. But another part, the part that had been buried for 3 years, whispered that some opportunities were worth the risk of exposure. She spotted Elena immediately, a woman in her late 30s with striking silver-streaked black hair pulled into a messy bun, vintage tortoiseshell glasses, and an aura of confident energy that seemed to create its own gravitational field. She was typing furiously on her laptop, a half-empty espresso cup and a croissant forgotten beside her as words poured across her screen. "Elena Vasquez?" Maya approached hesitantly, suddenly aware of how out of place she must look with her thrift store jeans and worn sneakers in this land of designer everything. Elena looked up, and her face immediately lit with recognition. "Maya! God, you're even more striking in daylight than you were last night. Please, sit." She gestured to the chair across from her, then immediately closed her laptop and gave Maya her full attention. "Can I get you something? Coffee? Pastry? A recording contract?" The last comment was delivered with such casual confidence that Maya wasn't sure if Elena was joking or not. "Just coffee, thanks. Black." Shalena signaled the server, then leaned forward with the intensity of someone who had spent her career identifying rare talent and understood she might be sitting across from something extraordinary. "Before we start, I need you to know that what happened last night has already begun to change your life, whether you realize it or not." Maya's stomach clenched. "What do you mean?" Elena pulled out her phone and scrolled to a video that had been posted on Instagram. Maya watched in horror as her own performance played on the small screen. Someone had recorded the entire thing, capturing not just her playing, but the stunned reactions of the guests and, most unsettling of all, Robert Sterling's shocked expression as he stared at her with something that looked disturbingly like recognition. This was posted around midnight by Hype Manhattan socialite, probably one of the guests at the party. As of this morning, it has 200,000 views and counting. The comments are... Elena paused, scrolling through them. "Well, let's just say you've touched a nerve. People are calling it everything from the most authentic musical moment of the decade to a perfect metaphor for class inequality in America. You're trending, Maya. The question is, what are you going to do about it?" Maya stared at the phone screen, watching herself play with an expression she'd never seen on her own face. Completely unguarded, lost in the music, vulnerable in a way that made her want to hide under the table. "I didn't ask for this." "The best artists never do," Elena replied gently. "But you have a choice to make, and you need to make it quickly. You can go back to being invisible, hope this blows over, and spend the rest of your life wondering, what if? Or you can step into the spotlight and show the world what you're really capable of. And if I'm not capable of what people think I am, what if last night was just a moment? Elena's expression softened. Maya, I've been covering music for 15 years. I've heard thousands of performances by artists with impeccable training, perfect technique, and unlimited resources. But what you did last night, that wasn't technique. That was truth. And truth is the one thing you can't fake, can't buy, and can't manufacture. The server brought Maya's coffee, and she wrapped her hands around the warm cup like an anchor. Tell me about the feature story. I want to write about you, not just the performance, but your journey. How does someone with your level of talent end up serving champagne to people who wouldn't recognize real artistry if it bit them on their Botoxed asses? Elena's directness was both refreshing and terrifying. But more than that, I want to give you a platform. I have connections at Lincoln Center, at recording studios, with agents who could change your life overnight. The question is, are you ready for that kind of change? Maya thought about her tiny apartment, her mounting student loans, the way she'd felt invisible for the past 3 years. Then she thought about the feeling of the cello against her shoulder last night, the way the music had poured out of her like something that had been trapped and was finally free. Oh, what would you need from me? Elena smiled, and Maya caught a glimpse of the passionate advocate who had championed dozens of unknown artists over her career. First, I need to hear you play again. Not for an audience of wealthy socialites, but just for me. I need to know that last night wasn't a fluke. Maya glanced around the busy park, acutely aware of the pedestrians and joggers who might recognize her from the viral video. Here. Why not? Art shouldn't be confined to concert halls and penthouses. Some of the most powerful music I've ever heard has been performed in subway stations and street corners. With trembling hands, Maya opened her case and assembled her cello. The familiar weight of the instrument against her shoulder was both comforting and terrifying. Comfort because it felt like coming home. Terrifying because she was about to expose herself again, this time to someone whose opinion could shape her entire future. She began with Bach's Cello Suite No. 1 again, but this time she let herself experiment with it, adding subtle variations that reflected her own musical voice rather than strict adherence to classical interpretation. As she played, she became dimly aware that other people in the park had begun to stop and listen. Joggers pausing mid-stride, dog walkers gathering in small clusters, office workers emerging from nearby buildings to see what was creating such beautiful sound in the middle of their ordinary Tuesday morning. When she finished, the scattered applause felt different from the polite appreciation of the Sterling penthouse. This was genuine, spontaneous, the kind of response that comes from people whose lives have been unexpectedly touched by beauty. Elena wiped tears from behind her glasses. Jesus, Maya, do you have any idea what you just did? Played a piece I've known since I was 12? You just turned Bryant Park into Carnegie Hall. Look around. Maya looked up to find herself surrounded by at least 50 people, their phones out, their faces reflecting the same mixture of awe and surprise she'd seen the night before. But this time, instead of feeling exposed and vulnerable, she felt something else. Powerful. For the first time in 3 years, she remembered what it felt like to move people with music, to create something beautiful that hadn't existed in the world 60 seconds earlier. I want to do the story, Maya said quietly, her decision crystallizing even as she spoke the words. But I have one condition. Name it. I want to know why Robert Sterling looked at me like he'd seen a ghost last night. There's something there, something he's not telling me. If I'm going to step into this spotlight, I need to know what shadows might be waiting for me. Elena's expression sharpened with journalistic interest. You think there's a connection between you and Sterling? Something beyond employee and employer? I don't know what I think, but the way he stared at me, the way his daughter has been asking questions about my background, something doesn't add up. What Maya didn't know was that at that very moment, 30 blocks south, Jimmy Torres was sitting in a small office in the financial district, staring at a computer screen that displayed the birth certificate of one Maya Eliza Washington, born 26 years ago in Chicago to Eliza Marie Washington, age 27, and father listed as unknown. The middle name had stopped Jimmy cold, Eliza. The same name that appeared in his boss's private files, the name connected to a series of mysterious payments made through a shell company for over 20 years. Payments that had only stopped 3 years ago, around the time a young woman named Maya Washington had arrived in New York and begun working for the Sterling household. Jimmy had been a detective long enough to recognize when seemingly unconnected pieces of information were actually part of a larger pattern. And this pattern was pointing toward a conclusion that could destroy his employer's carefully constructed life. He picked up his phone and dialed Robert Sterling's private number. "Sir, we need to talk, and we need to talk now." Meanwhile, in her Fifth Avenue office, Victoria Sterling Ashford was conducting her own investigation. As one of Manhattan's most ruthless corporate attorneys, she had resources and connections that made background checks look like child's play. She'd already pulled Maya's employment records, her credit history, and her academic transcripts from Juilliard. What she'd found there had made her blood run cold. Maya Washington hadn't just attended Juilliard, she'd been one of their most promising students, a scholarship recipient whose professors had predicted international stardom. But 3 years ago, she'd disappeared mid-semester, leaving behind a full scholarship and what appeared to be a guaranteed path to success. The timing of her departure coincided exactly with the timing of her arrival at the Sterling household. Victoria had built her career on understanding patterns, on seeing connections that others missed. And the pattern she was seeing now suggested that Maya Washington hadn't randomly ended up working for her family. She'd been placed there, either by design or by the kind of cosmic irony that could destroy everything Victoria had worked to protect. She picked up her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found the number for Marcus Reed, one of New York's most discreet private investigators. "Marcus, it's Victoria Sterling Ashford. I need a deep background check, and I need it yesterday. The subject is Maya Washington, and I have reason to believe she may pose a significant threat to my family's interests." As Victoria gave Marcus the details, she felt the familiar thrill that came with taking preemptive action against potential problems. Maya Washington might have charmed a room full of socialites with her musical talent, but Victoria had dealt with more sophisticated threats than a displaced music student with delusions of grandeur. What Victoria didn't consider was that some threats are most dangerous precisely when they don't realize they're threats at all. Back in Bryant Park, Maya was packing her cello while Elena outlined her vision for the story and the opportunities it could create. The crowd had dispersed, but several people had left business cards and contact information, and Maya's phone was buzzing with friend requests and messages from strangers who had seen the new video that someone had posted of her impromptu performance. "This is happening fast," Maya said, suddenly feeling overwhelmed by the speed at which her carefully controlled life was spinning out of her grasp. "The best opportunities always do," Elena replied. "The question is, are you ready to find out who you really are when the world is watching?" As Maya walked toward the subway that would take her back to Washington Heights, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was standing at the edge of a precipice. Behind her lay 3 years of safety, invisibility, and dreams deferred. Ahead lay uncertainty, exposure, and the possibility of reclaiming the life she'd abandoned. What she couldn't know was that the choice had already been made for her. In offices and conference rooms across Manhattan, powerful people were making decisions about her future, investigating her past, and setting in motion events that would force her to confront not just her own abandoned dreams, but the family's secrets that had shaped her entire existence. The girl who had spent 3 years being invisible was about to discover that visibility came with a price she had never imagined. And Robert Sterling, the man who had spent 27 years believing his past was safely buried, was about to learn that some secrets have a way of finding their way home. By evening, Maya's second performance would have over 1 million views across multiple platforms. By midnight, talent agents would be calling her phone. And by morning, the DNA test that Jimmy Torres had discreetly arranged would confirm what Robert Sterling already knew in his heart. The young woman whose musical genius had captivated Manhattan's elite was the daughter he had paid to disappear before she was even born. The price of visibility, Maya was about to learn, was the loss of control over your own story. And sometimes, the story that emerged was more complicated, more painful, and more transformative than anything you could have imagined. The Lincoln Center rehearsal room hummed with an energy Maya had almost forgotten existed. For the first time in 3 years, she was surrounded by serious musicians, a string quartet that Elena had assembled for what she'd called an artistic collaboration session, but what felt more like an audition for a life Maya had thought was permanently out of reach. 3 days had passed since her Bryant Park performance, and those 72 hours had transformed her existence so completely that she sometimes felt like she was living someone else's life. Her phone hadn't stopped buzzing with interview requests, performance offers, and messages from people claiming to be family friends, distant relatives, and music industry professionals who had always believed in her potential. The attention was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. From the top, called Marcus Chen, the violinist Elena had recruited from the New York Philharmonic. Maya, remember, this isn't a technical exercise. We're having a conversation in 4 languages, and your cello is the emotional interpreter. The Maya positioned her bow, feeling the familiar weight of expectation and possibility. They were working on an arrangement of Piazzolla's Libertango, reimagined as a fusion piece that incorporated elements of jazz, classical, and something indefinably modern that Maya was contributing through improvisation. As she began to play, she felt herself slip into the zone where music became language and technique became pure expression. What she couldn't know was that in a nondescript office building 20 blocks away, Jimmy Torres was staring at a manila envelope that contained the results of the most consequential DNA test of his professional career. Jimmy had been dreading this moment for 3 days, ever since he'd discreetly collected samples from both Robert Sterling's personal items and from a water glass Maya had left in the Sterling penthouse kitchen. As a former detective, he'd learned to trust his instincts about when investigations were about to uncover truths that would destroy lives. This felt like one of those times. He opened the envelope with steady hands, though his heart was racing. The scientific language was dense, but the conclusion was unmistakable. The probability of paternity is 97%. Based on the analysis of genetic markers, Subject A, Robert Sterling, is virtually certain to be the biological father of Subject B, Maya Washington. Jimmy stared at the document until the words blurred, then set it down and reached for his phone. This was information that could topple empires, destroy families, and reshape the entire power structure of New York's elite circles. It was also information that a young woman deserved to know about herself, regardless of the chaos it might cause. But Jimmy Torres had learned long ago that knowledge without context was dangerous, and context without strategy could be catastrophic. Before he made any calls, he needed to understand exactly what forces were already in motion around Maya Washington. His phone rang before he could dial. Victoria Sterling Ashford's name appeared on the screen, and Jimmy felt his stomach clench. Victoria never called him directly unless there was a crisis that required immediate damage control. "Jimmy, we need to meet now. I have information about our employee that requires urgent attention." "And what kind of information?" "The kind that could destroy my family if it becomes public. Can you be at my office in 30 minutes? Jimmy looked down at the DNA results, then carefully slid them back into the envelope. "I'll be there in 20. Meanwhile, Maya was discovering that stepping into the spotlight came with complications she hadn't anticipated. As she finished the Piazzolla piece, her phone buzzed with yet another call from an unknown number. She'd stopped answering them 2 days ago, but the voicemail messages were becoming increasingly persistent. "Hey, Maya, this is David Chen from the Brooklyn Music Academy. I know we haven't spoken since." "Well, since Juilliard, but I saw your performances online. I think we need to talk. There are opportunities here that you should know about, but also some concerns about how you're handling your sudden visibility." "Please call me back." David Chen. The name hit Maya like a physical blow, bringing back memories of her final days at Juilliard that she'd spent 3 years trying to forget. David had been her mentor, the professor who had pushed her harder than anyone else, who had seen something in her playing that even she hadn't recognized. He'd also been the person she'd disappointed most profoundly when she'd disappeared without explanation, abandoning a full scholarship and what he'd repeatedly called the most promising musical talent he'd encountered in 20 years of teaching. "You okay?" Marcus asked, noticing her sudden stillness. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Maybe I have," Maya murmured, staring at her phone. "Someone from my past just reached out, someone I thought I'd never hear from again." Elena, who had been taking notes in the corner, looked up with the sharp interest of a journalist who sensed a story developing. "Good past or bad past?" "Complicated past." Maya set down her cello and walked to the window, staring out at the bustle of Lincoln Center's plaza. "He was my professor at Juilliard before I left." "Why did you leave?" The question came from Sarah Kim, the violist, who had been quietly observing the entire rehearsal with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle. Maya was quiet for a long moment, weighing how much truth she was ready to share. For 3 years, she'd told herself that her departure from Juilliard was about financial pressures, about the impossibility of making it as a classical musician in a world that didn't value art. But the reality was more complicated and more painful. "I got scared," she said finally. "I was 23. I had professors telling me I could have an international career, and suddenly the pressure felt overwhelming. What if I wasn't as good as they thought? What if I failed publicly instead of just disappearing quietly?" "But so you chose to fail privately instead," Elena observed, her voice gentle but penetrating. "I chose to survive. There's a difference." What Maya didn't say, what she'd never told anyone, was that her departure from Juilliard had been triggered by a conversation with a financial aid counselor who had mentioned, almost casually, that her original scholarship funding had come from an unusual source, an anonymous benefactor who had specifically requested that she be supported. Someone with connections to the school but no official relationship to her family. The revelation had sent Maya spiraling into questions about her own worth, her own identity. Was her talent real? Or was she simply the pet project of someone with money to burn? Had she earned her place at one of the world's most prestigious music schools? Or was she there because of charity she hadn't asked for and didn't understand? Unable to reconcile those questions with her sense of self, she'd chosen to walk away from everything rather than risk discovering she was a fraud. Now, 3 years later, with her face trending on social media and talent scouts calling her phone, those same questions were resurfacing with renewed intensity. Her phone rang again. This time, it was Carlos. "Maya, you need to get back to the Sterling house. Now. What's wrong?" "I'm not supposed to work today." "It's not about work. There are photographers outside the building, and Mrs. Sterling is asking questions about you that I don't think you want her to find answers to. Also," Carlos lowered his voice, "Mr. Sterling has been acting strange all week. Stranger than usual. And his daughter has been here twice asking about your employment records." Maya felt the blood drain from her face. "I'll be there in an hour." She turned to Elena, who had been listening to the conversation with growing concern. "I have to go. There's something happening at my employer's house, and I think it might be related to all this publicity." "Maya, wait." Elena stood, her expression serious. "Before you go rushing into whatever this is, you need to understand something. When people become public figures overnight, especially people without powerful connections or legal representation, they become vulnerable in ways they don't expect. If the Sterling family is asking questions about you, it's not out of casual curiosity. They're protecting something, which means they see you as a threat." "Well, I'm not threatening anyone. I'm just trying to figure out how to be a musician again." "You're not just a musician anymore," Sarah Kim interjected. "You're a symbol. Every time someone shares that video of you playing in their penthouse, they're making a statement about class, about merit, about who deserves to be heard. Whether you intended it or not, you've become political." Maya stared at the faces around her, accomplished artists who understood the music world's complexities in ways she was just beginning to grasp. "What should I do?" "Be careful," Elena said simply. "And if anyone asks you to sign something or make any kind of statement about your relationship with the Sterling family, call me first." As Maya packed her cello and prepared to leave, she had no way of knowing that 20 blocks away, Victoria Sterling Ashford was sliding a folder across her desk to Jimmy Torres, a folder that contained school records, financial documents, and a timeline that painted a very clear picture of Maya Washington's connection to the Sterling family fortune. "This is what I've found so far," Victoria said, her voice cold and clinical. Maya Washington received anonymous scholarship funding at Juilliard. That funding came from Meridian Holdings, which is one of my father's shell companies. The same company that's been making monthly payments to an Eliza Washington in Chicago for over 20 years. Jimmy felt the DNA results burning in his jacket pocket like a live coal. And what are you suggesting? I'm not suggesting anything. I'm stating facts. My father has been financially supporting this woman and her daughter for decades. The daughter shows up at our house as an employee, and now she's becoming famous playing music that somehow makes my father look like he's seen a ghost. Victoria leaned forward, her eyes sharp with the predatory intelligence that made her one of Manhattan's most feared attorneys. I want to know what kind of leverage she has over him, and I want it neutralized before it destroys our family's reputation. Now, Victoria, you need to consider the possibility that this situation is more complicated than corporate espionage. Meaning what? Jimmy weighed his options. He could show her the DNA results, watch her world explode in real time, and deal with the consequences. Or he could try to manage the revelation more carefully, give Robert Sterling a chance to handle the situation on his own terms. Meaning your father is a complicated man with a complicated past. And Maya Washington might not be the threat you think she is. Victoria's smile was arctic. Everyone is a threat, Jimmy. The only question is what kind of threat they are and how to neutralize them before they realize their own power. As Maya descended into the subway that would take her back to the Sterling penthouse, she was unaware that her entire life was about to change again. Not because of her musical talent or her growing fame, but because of a secret that had been shaping her existence since before she was born. The collision between past and present, between the life Robert Sterling had built and the daughter he had abandoned, was no longer a matter of if, but when. And when it happened, everyone in its path, Maya, Robert, Victoria, and all the people who had become invested in Maya's story, would discover that some secrets are too powerful to stay buried, no matter how much money has been spent to keep them in the ground. The train rumbled through the darkness beneath Manhattan, carrying Maya toward a confrontation she didn't know was coming, while above her, in glass towers and corporate offices, the people who held her fate in their hands prepared for a battle that would determine not just her future, but the legacy of one of New York's most powerful families. The Sterling penthouse felt different when Maya stepped off the private elevator. The usual hum of household activity was absent, replaced by a tension so thick it seemed to press against her skin. Carlos met her at the entrance, his face grave with concern. "They're all in the main study," he whispered, glancing toward the hallway that led to Robert Sterling's private office. "Mr. Sterling, his daughter, and that security guy, Jimmy, they've been in there for over an hour, and from what I could hear." Carlos shook his head. "Maya, I think you should leave. Come back when whatever this is has blown over." But Maya was already walking toward the study, drawn by an instinct she didn't fully understand. Through the partially open door, she could hear voices, Robert's measured baritone, Victoria's sharp soprano, and Jimmy's careful tenor weaving together in what sounded like a negotiation where everyone was armed with different weapons. "But the DNA results are conclusive," Jimmy was saying, his voice heavy with reluctance. "There's no ambiguity here, Mr. Sterling. Maya Washington is your biological daughter." Maya's footsteps stopped as if she'd walked into an invisible wall. The words hit her like physical blows, each syllable rearranging her understanding of reality. Daughter, biological, DNA results. The phrases circled in her mind, refusing to form coherent meaning. "And you're absolutely certain of this?" Victoria's voice was ice over steel. Because if you're wrong, if there's even a 1% chance you're wrong, we could be making decisions based on—" "I'm not wrong." Jimmy's interruption was firm. "The test was conducted by the most reputable lab in the city. Robert Sterling is Maya Washington's father, which means she's your half-sister." The silence that followed was deafening. Maya pressed her back against the hallway wall, her legs suddenly unsteady. Half-sister. The phrase ricocheted through her consciousness, connecting dots she'd never known existed. The anonymous scholarship. The strange way Robert had looked at her. The reason she'd ended up working in this house, of all the houses in Manhattan. "This is a disaster." But Victoria's voice had dropped to a whisper. But Maya could hear every word. "Do you understand what this means? She's been living in our house, serving our guests, cleaning our floors, and she's family. The optics alone could destroy us. And now she's becoming famous, which means this story could break at any moment. Victoria, she doesn't know." Robert's voice, when he finally spoke, was hollow, aged beyond his 64 years. "She has no idea who she is, who I am to her. We still have options here." "Options?" Victoria's laugh was bitter. "Father, she's trending on social media. There are photographers outside our building. Every major music publication in the country wants to interview her. And you think we have options?" Amaya closed her eyes, feeling the world shift beneath her feet. Everything she'd believed about her life, her identity, her place in the world, was being rewritten by a conversation she was never supposed to hear. The father she'd never known, the family she'd never had, the questions that had haunted her entire existence. All of it was connected to the man whose floors she'd been cleaning for 2 years. "What do you want me to do?" Robert asked, and Maya heard something in his voice she'd never detected before. Vulnerability. "I want you to contain this situation before it destroys everything we've built," Victoria replied. "Pay her off. Give her enough money to disappear quietly, maybe relocate to Europe or the West Coast. Frame it as a generous settlement for her musical career. She gets what she wants, funding for her artistic ambitions, and we get our privacy protected. Yeah, you want me to buy off my own daughter?" The words came out like Robert was testing how they tasted. "And I want you to protect your family, your real family. The family that's been loyal to you, that's built something meaningful with you. Not the daughter you abandoned before she was born because it was inconvenient to your plans." Maya felt tears she didn't know she'd been holding spill down her cheeks. Abandoned. Before she was born? Inconvenient? Each word carved a deeper wound in places she'd thought were already scarred over. "That's not fair, Victoria." Jimmy's voice carried a warning. You don't know the circumstances. I know that my father made a choice 27 years ago, and that choice was to prioritize his career and his legitimate family over a mistress and her child. I'm asking him to make the same choice again, for the same reasons." Maya pushed herself away from the wall, her decision crystallizing even as her heart shattered. She couldn't listen to anymore. She couldn't stand in this hallway while people who shared her DNA discussed her life like she was a problem to be solved, a complication to be managed. She walked into the study. The 3 occupants looked up in shock as she appeared in the doorway, her face streaked with tears but her posture straight and dignified. Robert went pale. Victoria's mouth fell open, and Jimmy had the grace to look ashamed. "Maya," Robert started, but she held up her hand. "No, don't." Her voice was quiet, but it carried absolute authority. "I heard enough. I heard everything." Victoria recovered first, sliding immediately into damage control mode. "Maya, you need to understand that this is a complex family situation that requires—" "Complex?" Maya's voice rose, and for the first time in 3 years, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of her anger. "Complex. You want to know what's complex? Growing up thinking you have no family, no history, no biological connection to anyone in the world. Working 2 jobs to pay for cello lessons because the woman who raised you is living on Social Security. Getting into Juilliard and then finding out your scholarship came from an anonymous donor and spending 3 years wondering if you earned it or if someone just felt sorry for you." She looked directly at Robert, seeing her own eyes reflected in his face for the first time. "And then discovering that the anonymous donor was your biological father, who's been watching you from a distance your entire life but never bothered to actually be a father." Robert stood slowly, his hands shaking. "Maya, you don't understand. The circumstances when your mother and I were together," Maya finished. "Is that what we're calling it? You were married, she was young, and when she got pregnant, you paid her to disappear. Am I getting the story right?" The silence in the room was answer enough. Maya walked to the antique cello in the corner, the same instrument she'd played the night everything changed. She picked it up, cradling it against her shoulder, feeling its familiar weight settle into place. "Do you know what the worst part is?" she asked, her voice soft again but carrying more power than when she'd been shouting. "The worst part is that I've been carrying pieces of you with me my entire life, and I never knew it. The way I hear music, the way I understand complex harmonies, the way I can read emotions in people's faces, all of that came from you, didn't it?" Robert nodded, tears streaming down his face. "And you watched me struggle. You watched me leave school, watched me take a job cleaning your house, watched me serve your guests and empty your trash cans. And you never said a word." "I didn't know how," Robert whispered. "I didn't know how to tell you who I was, who you were. I was afraid you'd hate me." Maya drew her bow across the strings, producing a single, pure note that seemed to fill the entire room. "I don't hate you," she said, her voice barely audible above the fading sound. "But I don't forgive you either, and I won't be bought off, relocated, or managed." She looked at Victoria, whose face had gone from pale to furious. "And you're my sister, which means we share blood, but that's all we'll ever share. Because family, real family, isn't about DNA. It's about choosing to show up for each other, even when it's inconvenient." Maya carefully returned the cello to its stand and walked toward the door. When she reached it, she turned back one more time. "I'm going to keep making music. I'm going to accept every interview, every opportunity, every chance to tell my story. And if that story happens to include the fact that I'm the daughter of Robert Sterling, one of New York's most powerful men, then that's what the world will learn." She looked directly at Robert, memorizing his face, her father's face, for what she knew would be the last time in a very long while. "You had 27 years to be my father. I'm not giving you another 27 to figure out how." As Maya walked out of the Sterling penthouse for the final time as an employee, she felt something she hadn't experienced since she was a child: complete clarity about who she was and what she wanted. The girl who had spent 3 years hiding from her own potential was gone, replaced by a woman who understood that the most powerful music comes from the places that hurt the most. Behind her, in the study, Robert Sterling collapsed into his chair, staring at the door through which his daughter had just walked out of his life for the second time. The first time, he had been a coward who chose money and status over love and family. This time, he was a man who had finally met the consequence of that choice, embodied in a young woman who had inherited his musical gift, his stubborn pride, and his capacity for making decisions that changed everything. Victoria was already on her phone, calling her crisis management team, preparing to wage a public relations war to protect the family's reputation. Jimmy was staring at the DNA report, wondering if there had been a different way to handle a revelation that was always going to detonate like a bomb. And Maya was stepping out into the Manhattan afternoon, her cello case in her hand and her phone buzzing with messages from Elena, Carlos, and David Chen. For the first time in her adult life, she knew exactly who she was. Maya Eliza Washington, daughter of a billionaire and a woman who had loved music more than security, sister to people who saw her as a threat, and inheritor of a talent that had been trying to claim her for 26 years. The girl who had hidden in the shadows was about to step fully into the light, and when she did, she was going to make sure the whole world heard her sing.